The story of the Neolithic Age begins around 10,000 BCE, at the end of the last ice age. Picture a world emerging from thousands of years of bitter cold. Massive glaciers that had covered much of Europe and North America were slowly melting, creating new landscapes and opportunities for human survival. For hundreds of thousands of years before this moment, humans lived as nomads. They moved from place to place, following herds of animals and searching for wild plants to eat. Small groups of maybe 20 or 30 people would set up temporary camps, then pack up and move on when food became scarce. Life was hard, uncertain, and constantly changing, but as the ice retreated and temperatures warmed, something remarkable happened. Plants began growing in places where ice had been. Animals moved into new territories. Rivers formed from melting glaciers, creating fertile valleys perfect for new kinds of life. In different parts of the world, groups of humans began to notice that certain plants grew in the same places year after year. They watched how seeds fell from plants and grew into new ones. Slowly, very slowly, they began to understand that they could influence this process. They could choose which plants to encourage and which ones to remove. This realization didn't happen overnight. It took many generations for people to fully understand how to control plant growth. The first farmers were still mostly gatherers who simply paid more attention to their favorite food plants. They might clear away competing weeds or save the best seeds. For the next growing season, the change from hunting and gathering to farming was so gradual that the people living through it probably didn't realize they were starting a revolution. But they were creating the foundation for everything that would come after. Permanent villages, complex societies, written language, and all the achievements of human civilization. Different groups around the world made this discovery independently. In the Middle East, people began cultivating wheat and barley. In China, they learned to grow rice and millet. In the Americas, corn, beans, and squash became the foundation crops. Each region developed its own unique approach to farming based on the plants and animals available there. The Neolithic Age, also called the New Stone Age, marked the beginning of agriculture. But it was much more than just learning to farm. It represented a completely new way of thinking about the relationship between humans and nature. Instead of simply taking what nature provided, people began to actively shape their environment to meet their needs. The development of agriculture was the most important change in human history. It transformed not just how people got their food, but how they lived, worked, and organized their societies. This transformation took thousands of years and happened differently in various parts of the world. In the Fertile Crescent, an area that includes parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Turkey, the agricultural revolution began with wild grasses. Early farmers noticed that some grass seeds were larger and easier to harvest than others. Over many generations, they selected the best seeds to plant, gradually creating new varieties of wheat and barley that were much more productive than their wild ancestors. The process of domestication changed both plants and animals. Wild wheat and barley had seeds that scattered naturally when ripe, making them hard to harvest efficiently. But through careful selection, farmers developed varieties where the seeds stayed attached to the plant until harvested. This made farming much more efficient, but also made these plants completely dependent on humans for survival. At the same time, people were learning to domesticate animals. Wild sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were gradually tamed and bred to be more useful to humans. Domesticated animals provided not just meat, but also milk, wool, leather, and help with heavy work. They also provided fertilizer that made crops grow better. The domestication of plants and animals created a partnership between humans and other species that continues today. Humans provided care, protection, and help with reproduction. In return, domesticated species provided food, materials, and labor. Both humans and their domesticated partners became more successful than they had been in the wild. Agriculture allowed people to produce much more food than they could gather from wild sources. A single farmer could grow enough grain to feed several families. This surplus food meant that not everyone had to spend their time looking for food. Some people could specialize in making tools, pottery, or other useful items. The ability to store surplus food also provided security against hard times. If weather was bad one year, people could eat grain they had saved from previous years. This reduced the constant fear of starvation that had been part of human life for so long. However, farming also created new challenges. Crops could fail due to drought, floods, or insect pests. Farmers had to work very hard during planting and harvest seasons. Storage areas attracted rats and other pests. And the surplus food that made specialization possible also created inequality, as some people gained control over more resources than others. Despite these challenges, agriculture spread rapidly around the world. Groups that had learned to farm could support larger populations and often displaced or absorbed hunting and gathering societies. The advantages of agriculture were so great that within a few thousand years, most humans lived in agricultural communities. As agriculture developed, people began to settle down in permanent villages. This was a huge change from the nomadic lifestyle that humans had followed for hundreds of thousands of years. Building the first permanent settlements required solving many new problems and created opportunities for entirely new ways of life. One of the earliest and most famous Neolithic settlements was Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, which was occupied from about 7500 to 5700 BCE. This remarkable site gives us a detailed picture of what life was like in early agricultural communities. The village was home to several thousand people who lived in closely packed mud brick houses. The houses in Çatalhöyük were built right next to each other, sharing walls and creating a honeycomb-like pattern. People entered their homes through holes in the roof, climbing down wooden ladders. The roofs served as streets where people could walk from house to house. Each house typically had one large room where the family cooked, ate, worked, and slept. Inside these homes, archaeologists have found evidence of daily life from thousands of years ago. There were hearths for cooking, storage areas for grain and other supplies, and sleeping platforms covered with woven mats. The walls were decorated with paintings of animals, geometric patterns, and scenes from daily life. Some houses even had small shrines with sculptures and religious artifacts. The people of Çatalhöyük grew wheat, barley, peas, and lentils in fields outside the village. They also raised sheep, goats, and cattle. In addition to farming, they continued to hunt wild animals and gather wild plants, especially fruits and nuts. This combination of farming and foraging provided a varied and reliable food supply. Permanent villages like Çatalhöyük created new possibilities for human culture and technology. When people stayed in one place, they could accumulate possessions that would have been impossible to carry during nomadic travels. They could build better tools and equipment, create more elaborate artwork, and develop more complex social customs. Storage became a crucial part of village life. People needed to keep grain dry and safe from rodents and insects. They developed new technologies like pottery jars, underground storage pits, and raised granaries. The ability to store food for months or years ahead provided security and allowed communities to survive bad harvests. Villages also required new forms of social organization. When small nomadic groups had conflicts, they could simply separate and go different ways. But in permanent settlements, people had to learn to resolve disputes and cooperate closely with neighbors they couldn't easily avoid. They developed new rules, customs, and leadership structures to manage community life. The concentration of people in villages also led to rapid innovation. When skilled craftspeople lived close together, they could share techniques and improve their methods more quickly. Specialization became more common as some people focused on pottery, others on tool making, and others on farming or animal care. The Neolithic period brought remarkable advances in tools and technology that made daily life easier and more productive. These innovations were driven by the needs of agricultural life and the opportunities created by permanent settlements. Stone tools reached new levels of sophistication during the Neolithic Age. Earlier humans had made tools by chipping stones to create sharp edges. Neolithic craftspeople developed techniques for grinding and polishing stone to create much more effective tools. Polished stone axes were particularly important, as they made it much easier to clear forests for farming. The development of pottery was one of the most significant technological advances of this period. Clay pots could be used to store grain, cook food, and carry water. Different cultures developed their own distinctive pottery styles, often decorated with intricate patterns that tell us about their beliefs and artistic traditions. Pottery making required specialized knowledge about finding the right clay, shaping vessels, and controlling fire temperatures. Potters learned to build kilns that could reach much higher temperatures than ordinary cooking fires. This knowledge about controlling heat would later become crucial for metalworking. Weaving was another crucial Neolithic technology. People learned to make cloth from plant fibers like flax and from animal wool. Woven cloth was warmer, more durable, and more comfortable than animal skins. The development of weaving also led to new tools like spindles for making thread and looms for weaving cloth. Agriculture itself required many new tools and techniques. Farmers developed hoes for preparing soil, sickles for harvesting grain, and grinding stones for processing seeds into flour. They learned to make plows that could break up hard soil more efficiently than hand tools. The invention of the wheel, which appeared late in the Neolithic period, revolutionized transportation and pottery making. Daily life in Neolithic villages revolved around the seasonal cycles of farming. Spring was the time for planting, when everyone worked together to prepare fields and sow seeds. Summer required tending crops, weeding fields, and caring for animals. Autumn brought the intense work of harvest, when the entire community worked to gather and store the year's food supply. Winter was a time for indoor work like making tools, weaving cloth, and preparing for the next growing season. Women in Neolithic communities were often responsible for gathering wild plants, processing food, making pottery, and weaving cloth. They played crucial roles in developing many important technologies. Men typically handled the heaviest farming work, hunting, and tool making. But there was probably considerable overlap in responsibilities, and roles varied from one culture to another. Children in Neolithic communities learned by watching and helping adults. Young children might help with simple tasks like gathering eggs or feeding animals. As they grew older, they learned more complex skills like farming techniques, craft specializations, and social customs. By the time they were adults, they had mastered the knowledge needed to contribute fully to community life. The development of more sophisticated tools and technologies created a positive feedback loop. Better tools made farming more efficient, which created more surplus food, which allowed more people to specialize in crafts, which led to even better tools and techniques. The Neolithic period saw the development of complex religious beliefs and artistic traditions that reflected the new realities of agricultural life. As communities grew larger and more settled, people created elaborate systems of belief and social organization that helped bind their societies together. Religious practices in Neolithic communities often centered around the cycle of seasons and the fertility of crops and animals. People developed rituals to ensure good harvests, to thank the spirits for successful crops, and to ask for protection from natural disasters. Many Neolithic cultures worship goddesses associated with fertility, earth, and the life-giving power of nature. Archaeological evidence from sites like Çatalhöyük reveals sophisticated religious practices. Houses contained shrines with carefully crafted sculptures, often featuring female figures, bulls, and other animals important to the community. Wall paintings depicted religious ceremonies, hunting scenes, and geometric patterns that may have had spiritual significance. The development of agriculture seems to have changed how people thought about death and the afterlife. Many Neolithic cultures practiced elaborate burial rituals, often burying people with valuable grave goods like pottery, tools, and jewelry. Some communities buried their dead beneath the floors of houses. keeping ancestors literally close to the living family. Megalithic monuments. Giant stone structures built during the late Neolithic period represent some of humanity's first monumental architecture. Sites like Stonehenge in England, Newgrange in Ireland, and Göbekli Tepe in Turkey required tremendous organization and labor to build. These monuments probably served both religious and social functions, providing places for ceremonies and demonstrating the power and unity of the community. Art became much more sophisticated during the Neolithic period. Pottery was decorated with intricate patterns that often had symbolic meaning. People created sculptures, carved ornaments, and painted elaborate murals. Some of the world's earliest textiles show complex woven patterns that demonstrate both artistic skill and cultural symbolism. The growth of permanent settlements led to more complex social structures. In small nomadic groups, everyone had known everyone else personally, and leadership was usually informal and temporary. But villages with hundreds or thousands of people needed more formal organization. Evidence suggests that Neolithic communities developed various forms of social hierarchy. Some people gained higher status through their skills as farmers, craftspeople, or religious leaders. Certain families might control more land or livestock than others. However, most Neolithic societies seem to have been much more equal than later civilizations. Trade networks developed as different communities specialized in producing particular goods. Villages located near sources of high-quality stone might focus on tool-making, while others emphasized pottery or textiles. This specialization and trade created connections between communities across large distances. The development of more complex social structures also led to new forms of conflict. While small nomadic groups rarely fought organized battles, larger agricultural communities sometimes came into conflict over land, water, or trade routes. Archaeological evidence shows that some Neolithic settlements were surrounded by defensive walls or located in easily defended positions. Leadership in Neolithic communities probably varied considerably from place to place. Some villages may have been led by councils of elders, others by successful farmers or skilled craftspeople, and still others by religious leaders. The concentration of valuable grave goods in some burials suggests that certain individuals had higher status, but extreme inequality was probably rare. The agricultural revolution didn't happen just once, but developed independently in many different parts of the world during the Neolithic period. Each region had its own unique combination of domesticated plants and animals, and agriculture spread from these centers of innovation to surrounding areas through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The Middle East was probably the first region where agriculture developed, beginning around 11,000 years ago in the area known as the Fertile Crescent. The key crops were wheat, barley, lentils, and peas, along with domesticated sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. From this center, farming spread into Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia. In China, agriculture developed independently around 9,000 years ago along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. Northern China became a center for growing millet, while southern China focused on rice cultivation. Chinese farmers also domesticated pigs, chickens, and later developed silk production from domesticated silkworms. The Americas saw multiple independent developments of agriculture. In Mexico, people began cultivating corn, beans, and squash around 8,000 years ago. This combination of crops, sometimes called the Three Sisters, provided a balanced diet and formed the foundation for complex civilizations like the Maya and Aztec. In South America, people in the Andes developed potato cultivation and llama domestication, while Amazonian peoples cultivated manioc and other tropical crops. New Guinea and parts of Southeast Asia developed agriculture based on bananas, taro, and other tropical plants. African agriculture began in multiple locations, with different crops like sorghum, yams, and African rice being domesticated in different regions. Each of these agricultural centers developed unique techniques, adapted to local climate and soil conditions. The spread of agriculture From these centers of origin was a gradual process that took thousands of years. Sometimes farming techniques spread through trade contacts, as people shared seeds and knowledge with neighboring groups. Other times, farming populations migrated to new areas, bringing their agricultural knowledge with them. In Europe, agriculture spread from the Middle East through two main routes. One path followed the Mediterranean coast, while another moved up the Danube River Valley into Central Europe. Archaeological evidence shows that farming reached Britain and Scandinavia around 6,000 years ago, about 5,000 years after it had developed in the Middle East. The spread of agriculture often involved the mixing of different cultural traditions. Local hunting and gathering peoples might adopt some crops from incoming farmers while maintaining many of their traditional practices. In other cases, farming communities might learn about local wild plants and animals from indigenous peoples. Climate played a crucial role in determining where and when agriculture could spread. Some crops that grew well in one region couldn't survive in different climates. Farmers had to adapt their techniques and sometimes develop new varieties of crops suited to local conditions. This process of adaptation and innovation continued throughout the Neolithic period. The adoption of agriculture usually led to population growth, as farming could support many more people per square mile than hunting and gathering. This population growth often put pressure on remaining hunter-gatherer groups, leading to either adoption of farming or displacement to areas unsuitable for agriculture. By the end of the Neolithic period, agriculture had spread to most regions of the world where it was climatically possible. The major exceptions were areas like Australia, where the native plants and animals were not suitable for domestication, and regions like the Arctic, where the climate was too harsh for traditional farming. The Neolithic Age came to an end around 3000 BCE in most parts of the world, as people began to work with metals and develop the complex societies we call civilizations. But the foundations laid during this remarkable period continue to shape human life today, thousands of years later. The most obvious legacy of the Neolithic period is agriculture itself. The crops that Neolithic farmers domesticated thousands of years ago still provide most of humanity's food. Wheat, rice, corn, barley, and other Neolithic crops feed billions of people around the world. The techniques of farming, animal domestication, and food storage that were developed during this period remain the foundation of modern agriculture. The social changes that began in the Neolithic period set the stage for all later human development. The ability to produce surplus food allowed for specialization and the development of complex societies. The concept of property ownership, which probably began with land and stored grain, became a fundamental part of human economic systems. Permanent settlements that began as simple Neolithic villages eventually grew into towns, cities, and the massive urban areas where most humans live today. The challenges of organizing large communities that first appeared in places like Çatalhöyük led to the development of government, law, and complex social institutions. Many of the technologies developed during the Neolithic period remained important for thousands of years. Pottery, weaving, and polished stone tools were used throughout the ancient world, and in some places continued to be important until modern times. The techniques for controlling fire that were developed for pottery making led directly to the development of metallurgy, the religious and artistic traditions that emerged during the Neolithic period, established patterns that influenced human culture for millennia. The monuments built by Neolithic peoples, like Stonehenge and the temples of Malta, continue to inspire wonder and study today. The artistic traditions of pottery decoration, textile design, and sculptural representation that began in the Neolithic period evolved into the rich artistic traditions of later civilizations. Perhaps most importantly, the Neolithic period represents the moment when humans gained the ability to actively shape their environment rather than simply adapting to it. This fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and nature made possible all the achievements and challenges of later human history. The population growth that began in the Neolithic period has continued to the present day. The few million humans who lived as hunter-gatherers at the end of the last ice age had grown to several billion by the end of the Neolithic period, setting the stage for the massive populations of today. The Neolithic period also established patterns of human impact on the environment that continue today. Deforestation to create farmland, the extinction of large animals, and the creation of artificial landscapes all began during this period. Understanding these early environmental changes helps us better understand the environmental challenges facing humanity today. In many ways, we are still living in an extended Neolithic period. Despite all our technological advances, most humans still depend on the same domesticated plants and animals that were first developed thousands of years ago. We still live in permanent settlements, practice specialized occupations, and organize ourselves into complex societies. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the incredible journey that began during the Neolithic Age. Every meal you eat, every building you enter, and every community you belong to has its roots in the innovations of those early farmers who first decided to plant seeds instead of simply gathering what nature provided. Their quiet revolution in small villages created the foundation for everything that followed in human history. The story of the Neolithic Age reminds us that the most important changes in human history often happen gradually, through the accumulated efforts of countless ordinary people making small improvements to their daily lives. Those ancient farmers and craftspeople probably had no idea they were creating the foundation for all human civilization. They were simply trying to make life a little better for their families and communities. Rest well, knowing that you are part of a story that began thousands of years ago and continues to unfold today. The ingenuity, cooperation, and perseverance that characterized the Neolithic period remain essential human qualities that guide us as we face the challenges of our own time.